Hello everyone, Stephen here. Today we're bringing you something a little different that we think you'll really enjoy. It is a preview of an all-new audiobook, Douglas Adams' The Ends of the Earth, which celebrates the wit and wisdom of the legendary science fiction author Douglas Adams, of course, of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and Dirk Gently's holistic detective agency. Douglas Adams' first TV job, of course, actually on Doctor Who, and the audiobook dives into his connection to and love of Doctor Who and how it influenced his later writing. It also features never-before-heard audio from Adams' estate, interviews with his close friends and collaborators like Stephen Fry and David Baddiel, and leading Whovian James Goss, and reenactments of his work. The preview you are about to hear examines how Douglas thought of himself as a science fiction and comedic writer, looks back on his time working on Doctor Who, and explores the films, books, and TV shows that would come to influence his craft. Of course, Douglas Adams wrote some of our favorite stories of Doctor Who on this podcast. Chris even met him at a Macworld in the late 90s before his untimely passing, of course. And it's not the first time that we've sort of delved into Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy on this podcast, and probably not the last, dare I say. So anyway, here's the preview. We hope you enjoy it as much as we did. If you do, you can get Douglas Adams' The Ends of the Earth now at Audible, Spotify, push.fm/audiobooks, or wherever audiobooks are sold.
Chapter 1. Writing. If we are to investigate this idea of Douglas as a general-purpose genius, then we should probably start with the sphere in which he had his greatest successes, as a science fiction novelist. Surely we can all agree that Douglas Adams was a genius science fiction writer.
I never actually thought of myself as a science fiction writer. I thought myself primarily a comedy writer, and I became a science fiction writer simply because I exaggerated so much.
Most science fiction is actually extremely badly written. The ideas may be great, but the writing is just, I find it really hard work to deal with. Isaac Asimov, for instance, who has terrific ideas, which are really very interesting, but he writes like a piece of American Express junk mail. It's not proper writing, and my eyes get irritated.
For the science fiction fans among us, this is a bitter pill to have to swallow. It's tough enough to have anyone mock a genre you love, but to have science fiction taken down by one of its high priests, well, that's a very specific type of betrayal. The creator of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy didn't like science fiction? What on earth is going on? Have we all missed something? Here's Stephen Fry, the British comedian, author, actor, general polymath, and one of Douglas's closest friends, talking about his reaction upon first reading Hitchhiker.
I hadn't noticed it was science fiction, because all the things about science fiction that I dislike, all the things that appeal to the sort of bottle-end spectacles brigade, these sort of dreary arguments about, apparently he broke the second rule of the Federation by entering the stained quadrant at the wrong time, and all this kind of drivel. Didn't seem to be there. It was absolutely...
This just gets worse and worse. Not only does Douglas Adams not like science fiction, but his best friend, comedy and intellectual icon and national treasure Stephen Fry, is mocking science fiction fans. And he's praising Hitchhiker only because it is not like other science fiction. This is agonizing. Why am I including this stuff in here? This is tantamount to hate crime. There is a deep disconnect going on here, because Hitchhiker wasn't Douglas's only science fiction work. Dirk Gently is profoundly grounded in ideas from theoretical physics, and Douglas's first real television job was on Doctor Who, the ever-regenerating granddaddy of all British science fiction. I spoke about this with James Goss, a science fiction author and a leading Whovian. James and I have known each other since we were schoolboys together. In fact, it was with James that I first adapted Dirk Gently as a play, and we met Douglas together on the same fateful night.
Hello, I'm James Goss, and I am a writer, and I've adapted various of Douglas's Doctor Who scripts into novels, and I guess I first encountered Douglas Adams by watching the Hitchhiker's TV series, which I thought was great.
Now, For those of you who aren't deep Doctor Who fans, there's a lot of jargon and inside TARDIS talk in what James is about to say. So let me give a quick guide. 1. Doctor Who is an immortal alien, a time-traveling Time Lord who seems to spend most of his days hanging out with attractive Earth women and foiling alien plots. He does this in a time-traveling police box called the TARDIS. Footnote on the footnote, a police box was a public telephone kiosk used to contact the police. The TARDIS looks like one, but it isn't one. It is also, famously, bigger on the inside. 2. The show, which has been running on and off for more than 60 years, is one of the longest-running television shows in history. Multiple generations of British children have grown up with it, and it is a cultural touchstone that transcends science fiction. It is as if Star Trek and Saturday Night Live were the same show. Some of the greatest writers in British television, including Russell T Davies, creator of Queer as Folk, and Stephen Moffat, co-creator of the Benedict Cumberbatch Sherlock, have served as showrunners. 3. To that list, add Douglas Adams, who served as script editor, which in his case was effectively lead writer, between 1979 and 1980. During that time, he wrote 3 legendary episodes: Sharda, which was never completed, City of Death, generally regarded as one of the best Doctor Who stories ever made, and finally, The Pirate Planet. Okay, explainer over. Back to James.
You do realise that Douglas was the biggest Doctor Who fan. One of the most astonishing things about Douglas, especially his Doctor Who work, is you can literally, in all of his Doctor Who scripts, and even in some of his Hitchhikers ones, you can go, he's parodying an episode of Doctor Who, and they are very specific episodes of Doctor Who. There's a whole chunk of a missing episode of Doctor Who that turns up in Life, the Universe and Everything. So an episode from like 1966 where the TARDIS arrives on Lord's cricket ground turns up in Life, the Universe and Everything very, very famously. And it's like, that is a childhood memory that he's carried forward into one of his Hitchhiker's books. And similarly, the whole idea of the B arc and the A arc and all of that is lifted both from a 60s Doctor Who story called The Ark, but also from an early 70s Doctor Who story called Ark in Space. Both of them brilliant. And clearly Douglas Adams kept watching them all and at the back of his head went, yes, but. And just the sheer joy of seeing these ideas just turn up over and over again. I don't think Douglas Adams would be writing Hitchhikers if he hadn't seen Doctor Who. And if he hadn't carried on absolutely loving it when he was an adult. That's my argument.
Now, James is an intense sort, passionate about science fiction in general and ready to defend Doctor Who in particular to the death. But he also knows both Doctor Who and Douglas Adams' work better than almost anyone alive. So is he right? Did Douglas Adams secretly love science fiction? The trouble is that Douglas himself talked about this period of his career as mere journeyman work, a stop-off on the way to Hitchhiker. Listen to him here being interviewed on Terry Wogan's chat show in the mid-80s.
First of all, science fiction. It's not something that... I suppose you were writing Doctor Who at the time. Is that how it occurred?
Well, no, that was coincidence, actually. I never actually thought of myself as a science fiction writer.
Terry Wogan, at the time of this interview, is the dominant chat show host on British television. He's Johnny Carson rolled into Stephen Colbert with a side order of the Jimmies combined. So, the condescension in Wogan's voice in the unfinished sentence, science fiction is not something that, is the condescension of the mainstream to the fringe. Not something that what? That decent people, that proper writers, that grown-ups do? And note also that Douglas doesn't defend science fiction at all. He seems happy to bat it aside. James Goss, however, who as part of his work adapting Douglas's scripts into novels, has had unfettered access to the Doctor Who archives, makes a pretty convincing case that despite his public denials, in his heart of heart, Douglas loved Doctor Who and brought his genius to it in a very specific fashion.
The thing that astonished me with The Pirate Planet is, Douglas's first ever Doctor Who TV script seems to be famously shambolic. It's an absolute mess about space pirates and traveling spaceships. It's all the ideas you've ever known in Doctor Who. It's an explosion of ideas. And then when I was going through the notes, you realize that it's the most incredibly structured Doctor Who. I remember chatting about it with Russell T Davies, and he went, "It's my favorite story because it's so clever." And the story is so clever because there are charts. In Douglas's notes, there are charts where he plots the moral journeys of every character. The entire story is about genocide and whether or not people knew and their guilt and how that guilt is passed down to generations. So it seems to be about robot parrots and space pirates and exploding planets and things like that. But it's really all about a whole society that is made rich by devouring other planets and whether or not they know, and the collective guilt starts to poison them. So there are pages and pages of charts where he just draws out the journey of guilt and how that guilt affects people. It's a story about people poisoned by their own immorality. But everybody just goes, "Oh, it's the one with the tin space pirate and his robot parrot." And you go, "Yeah, it is, but it's so much more than that."
How do we reconcile the image of the 20-something Douglas Adams on his first screenwriting job, spending time making detailed charts of the moral guilt of a civilization, with the glibness with which he dismisses science fiction less than a decade later? Let's go back to that clip of him being interviewed by Terry Wogan.
What kind of people read science fiction? I know everybody read The Hitchhikers, but what kind of people do you think read science fiction?
To be on Wogan's show is a very big deal. So when he says, "What sort of people read science fiction?" the subtext in his intonation is, not people like us, not people like you, me, or our audience, not normal people. If Douglas was truly suspicious of science fiction, he could have made a cheap joke here, of the type Stephen Fry made about the thick reading glasses of the science fiction fan. But he doesn't. This is what he says about who reads science fiction.
A pretty wide cross-section. People never like to admit it, actually. Whenever I do book signing sessions, you always get people come along, sort of men come along and say, "Would you sign this, please? It's for my little boy." And then you get little boys come along and say, "Would you sign this, please? It's for my father." Yeah. So you get the widest possible cross-section.
Now, this is a change in tone. Douglas does not mock science fiction fans, as Wogan is inviting him to do. Instead, he defends the fandom. He recognizes their humanity as fathers and sons, and says, by implication, that these are the same people, the same wide cross-section, who are watching this TV show right now. And, in a gesture of compassion, he recognizes the slight shame that science fiction fans were forced to feel in the 1980s. 13 years later, in 1999, Douglas is once again given the chance to defend or deny sci-fi fans on the then very popular morning show, The Big Breakfast. Here he is talking to host and pop culture pundit Johnny Vaughan.
What do you think it is about sci-fi fans? Why do people get so anorackish about it?
Well, they do say that real life is a crutch for those who can't handle science fiction. I guess that people tend to be very weird, and there's a little bit of me that's a little bit weird, and I kind of sort of plug into that, I suppose. But I used to love science fiction when I was a kid. I don't anymore because it's kind of too close to home. Yeah. And I actually watched the first ever episode of Doctor Who when it went out.
Again, Douglas goes sort of halfway in defense of the genre that has made him rich and famous. He makes a clever swipe at people who don't get science fiction and who denigrate those who do, and then, conceding that while some of the fandom is weird, he makes clear that he is one of them, one of us. He is, at least a little bit, weird too. In fact, Douglas's love for and understanding of science fiction goes far deeper than he admits here. The truth appears to be that Douglas was a huge sci-fi and comic book fan as a child, and he often cited Kurt Vonnegut as an influence. Unsurprisingly, it was James Goss who found the smoking gun in the case that Douglas Adams remained, in his deepest heart, a proper science fiction geek. In 1977, Douglas was developing a Doctor Who feature film. Now, his bosses at the BBC were extremely skeptical of the idea of a science fiction movie. Given that this was about 18 months before Star Wars came out, it probably says a lot about the BBC's ability to anticipate trends. But Douglas was convinced, and to make his case, he wrote a detailed treatise on how to make a proper science fiction film. Here's an extract from that treatise, read by James Goss.
Science fiction in films. It is a question of getting the angle right. It has been tried many times unsuccessfully. This is probably because the average non-sci-fi reading member of the public probably sees sci-fi as being gloomy, extrapolations of present tendencies towards totalitarianism. Verdict: boring. Even I, as a science fiction fan, do not go and see these films. Science fiction must not ignore what we already know. It can go way beyond it on fantastic flights of fantasy, but the structure of the fantastic must be logical. And this is a lot of the beauty of science fiction, the wild fantasies that can be created from imaginative, logical extrapolations of what we already know. For instance, it is completely unacceptable in modern sci-fi to talk of spaceships travelling faster than light, because Einstein must be taken into account. However, theories of hyperspace which allow instantaneous transportation are acceptable. In other words, current knowledge can be argued against, but not thrown out the window. Again, black holes. A marvellous area for fantasy, but it must be informed fantasy. Anything a writer invents about black holes must take into account the arguments put forward by the theorists. A science fiction audience wants to make that suspension of disbelief, and you must allow him to do that by not insulting his intelligence. However, this does not in any way preclude the adventure romp like Doctor Who or Harry Harrison, which is one of the brightest and best areas of sci-fi because it can be so outrageous in its fantasy. But the fun and the skill of it is the maintenance of the inner logic. All the best wild ideas in surreal comedy, science fiction, spy thrillers, etc. adhere to a strict inner logic. Without logic, there is no surprise and no joy.
Without logic, there is no surprise and no joy. That feels like a golden rule in the universe according to Douglas Adams. Douglas was in his mid-20s when he wrote that. Hitchhiker and all it brought is ahead of him. He's just a few years out of university, but already you can see the mercilessly rigorous intellect at work, taking incredibly seriously the demands of science fiction as a genre and full of respect for its audience. For those of us who love science fiction, and in particular, those of us who love science fiction because of Douglas Adams, this comes as a huge relief. It is also true, however, that science fiction was not the sole tradition that Douglas drew from when he created Hitchhiker. As, or more important, was the inspiration of comedy. The specific influence that is most talked about is that of Monty Python, in part because Douglas actually worked with the Python crew for a few years, mainly through his co-writing partnership with Graham Chapman. But once he moved past the realm of sketch comedy and became a novelist, there is no question who Douglas's touchstone was. The author who he most venerated and emulated was not a science fiction novelist at all, but a comic novelist, PG Wodehouse, creator of Jeeves and Wooster. Here, once again, is Stephen Fry.
Douglas and I shared many passions and many preferences and peccadillos and peculiarities, and one of them, of which we were deeply proud, was an adoration of the great PG Wodehouse, Sir Pelham Grenville Wodehouse, who died with a manuscript on his lap in his 90s, still writing to the very end. And the manuscript was of a story called Sunset at Blandings.
It was reprinted again in the 90s, I think, and they asked Douglas very wisely if he would write an introduction. And here is some of what he wrote. One of the most blissful joys of the English language is the fact that one of its greatest practitioners ever, one of the guys at the very top table of all, was a jokesmith. Though maybe it shouldn't be that big a surprise. Who else would be up there? Austen, of course, Dickens, and Chaucer. The only one who couldn't make a joke to save his life would be Shakespeare. We Wodehouse fans are very fond of phoning each other up with new discoveries. But we may do the great man a disservice when we pull out our favourite quotes in public, like ice formed on the Butler's upper slopes. Or, here I go again, my current favourite, he spun round with a sort of guilty bound, like an adagio dancer surprised while watering the cat's milk. Because, irreducibly wonderful though they are, by themselves they're a little like stuffed fish on a mantelpiece. You need to see them in action to get the full effect. There is not much in Freddie Threepwood's isolated line, "I have here in this sack a few simple rats," to tell you that when you read it in context, you are at the pinnacle of one of the most sublime moments in all English literature. Shakespeare, Milton, Keats. How can I possibly mention the author of Pearls, Girls and Monty Bodkin and Pigs Have Wings in the same breath as these men? He's just not serious. He doesn't need to be serious. He's better than that. He's up in the stratosphere of what the human mind can do, above tragedy and strenuous thought, where you will find Bach, Mozart, Einstein, Feynman, and Louis Armstrong, in the realms of pure, creative playfulness.
That is one of the rare pieces of literary criticism that lives up to the genius of the writing it is describing. Genius? Yes, because I happen to be in the camp of people who completely agree with Douglas and Stephen. Wodehouse deserves his place amongst the greats, and readers who know both Douglas Adams and PG Wodehouse will immediately recognize the influence. Both are champions of transferred epithets, unexpected metaphors, similes that turn on a dime, of elaborate, convoluted plotting that pays off to huge comic effect, and of the constant use of bathos to undercut a poignant moment. Now, just to approach Wodehouse's comic genius and his extraordinary, exacting sentence construction, his ear for the musicality of language would be achievement enough. But what Douglas does is to take Wodehouse's methods and apply them in a whole new way. Here, once again, is Stephen Fry.
Wodehouse stayed within a very, very closed milieu, which is what we value so highly in him. It's his world, and we step through into it every time we pick up one of his books. We are transported into a very particular individual world that Wodehouse stays in and his characters stay in, whereas Douglas is exploring. He's pushing the frontiers, literally going to the ends of the universe and playing with time and chance and all the most enormous concepts that we have.
To take the methods of a grand master and apply them in a whole new way is of itself, I would argue, the move of a genius. Another aspect of Wodehouse that Douglas shared was his perfectionism and his compulsive rewriting. In the same essay that Stephen has just read from, Douglas described Wodehouse's habit of pinning up the typewritten pages on the walls of his study. Wodehouse would start at the floor level and pinned each subsequent improvement higher up the wall, till eventually the entire novel would exist at the level of the picture rail, and then, and only then, was it ready for publication. Douglas's own methods of writing, or not writing, are legendary, but his compulsive need to rewrite till the thing got to perfection was always apparent in him. He once said that he could never really understand anything until he could make a good joke about it. And even in this making of jokes, he was obsessive.
My name is Griff Rhys-Jones, and I'm a sort of bit of a writer and a little bit of a sort of businessman in a funny sort of way, and a very, very old friend of Douglas's, because I was at senior school, from the age of 11 with Douglas, and sort of would have met him about the age of 12 because we were in plays together.
I talked to Griff Rhys-Jones for a couple of hours. It was perhaps the funniest and most raucous interview that I conducted for this book. Of the many wonderful stories he told about his long history with Douglas, there was one that stood out. Here is Griff talking about a late-night drive he had with Douglas. The third person in the car is the late, great comedian Mel Smith.
He was quite involved in the process of tweaking out jokes. It's one of the things that made him quite complicated as a performer of his own material. One year, Mel and I got in contact. We were at Cannes Film Festival. I was only there once with a terrible film. We were put up and we invited Douglas down because Douglas was there, and Douglas loved the good things. Let's not forget that. He absolutely adored expensive food. He adored wine. He adored that whole... There was nothing, egalitarian about Douglas when it came to pampering Douglas. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So he said, let's go off to this really expensive restaurant up in the hills, so we did. Mm-hmm. And we then got a car, huge expense, to get us back to the Hotel de Cap, where Mel and I had been put up for the duration. And the day before, Douglas had come over for lunch, and we'd run up the most colossal bill, drinking Armagnac and things like that in the dining room. And on the way back in the car, I distinctly remember this, Douglas started to tell a story. And Mel didn't know Douglas very well. We were sitting in the back of the car for some reason, and Douglas in the front next to the driver. And Douglas would get halfway through the story and start talking to himself. And we'd have to say, Douglas, we can't hear you. And he'd go back to the beginning or halfway through the story and start to tell it again, improving the anecdote, writing it in front of him, improving the anecdote. You go, but Douglas, I've heard this bit. He never quite understood that the secret of telling a story, if you like, is to follow through to the very end and not just sort of stop and think, no, there's a better way of expressing this. And let me try and go back to the beginning again and start reframing the whole anecdote to turn it into the perfect anecdote, which, of course, is a process which suits a writer very well, but doesn't really suit a performer or indeed sometimes a companion. It's a rather bizarre sort of self-indulgent. So he could be a little bit self-indulgent like that, but we forgave him because he was obviously, a great writer.
Pause for a moment and realize what a very strange story Griff Rhys-Jones is telling us here. 3 young creatives on the upswing of their careers, reveling in their youthful success, go for a night out on the tiles at the Cannes Film Festival. Then, in the car, on the way back to their magnificent hotel, they swap funny stories. Except, Douglas Adams isn't telling stories, he's writing them. Half drunk, he's compulsively going back to the beginning of his story and redrafting it, trying to make it better, to advance it further up the wall in PG Wodehouse's study, until it could touch the picture rail of the great master he so wanted to emulate. This is a man who was a writer to his core, who is rigorous about writing, all writing, science fiction, comedy, even drunken funny stories, drafting and redrafting, analyzing and reworking. Whilst Douglas might have been more public about the influence of comedy and comedians than he was about science fiction, don't think comedy got a free pass either. Here is an essay he wrote in the year 2000, a few months before he died, read by Dirk actor Samuel Barnett.
There's always a moment when you start to fall out of love, whether it's with a person or an idea or a cause, even if it's one you only narrate to yourself years after the event. You know, a tiny thing, a word, a false note, which means that things can never be quite the same again. For me, it was hearing a stand-up comedian make the following observation. These scientists, they're so stupid. You know those black box flight recorders they put on aeroplanes? And you know they're meant to be indestructible. It's always the thing that doesn't get smashed. So why don't they make the planes out of the same stuff? The audience roared with laughter at how stupid scientists were, couldn't think their way out of a paper bag. But I sat feeling uncomfortable. Was I just being pedantic to feel that the joke didn't really work? Because flight recorders are made out of titanium, and that if you made planes out of titanium rather than aluminium, they'd be far too heavy to get off the ground in the first place. I began to pick away at the joke. Supposing Eric Morecambe had said it, would it be funny then? Well, not quite, because that would have relied on the audience seeing that Eric was being dumb. In other words, they would have had to know, as a matter of common knowledge, about the relative weights of titanium and aluminium. There was no way of deconstructing the joke. If you think this is obsessive behaviour, you should try living with it. That didn't rely on the teller and the audience complacently conspiring together to jeer at someone who knew more than they did. It sent a chill down my spine, and still does. I felt betrayed by comedy. I also began to wonder how many of the jokes I was making were just, well, ignorant.
There's so much to unpack in this little analysis. First, you can sense the pain in Douglas, a lifelong comic writer feeling regretfully and sadly the limits of comedy. Also, note his disappointment, his fear even, at what we would later come to recognize as a growing distrust in experts, in science and the scientific method. What is also fascinating is how Douglas's rigorous application of logic to humour calls back so clearly to his prescription for successful science fiction writing. Without logic, there is no surprise and no joy, he wrote in 1978 at the start of his career. And here, 22 years later, near the end of his life, he continues with relentless, obsessive logic to drill down, to take apart a joke that he felt was not only illogical, but more importantly, was devoid of joy. A joke that was motivated by a meanness of spirit and a distrust of science that was antithetical to Douglas Adams. I hope by now it's becoming clear that to describe Douglas as a particular type of genre writer, whether that genre was comedy or science fiction, is missing the point. The answer is, of course, that he was both, but that defining him by reference to a category doesn't give us a complete view of the type of writer he was. Genius transcends categorization. Being confronted with a talent that won't fit neatly into a category is one of the ways you know that you're dealing with a genius. There is a contemporary idea, a meme really, the parable of the 10,000 hours. The idea that one can achieve mastery of a given domain through 10,000 hours of focused practice. Malcolm Gladwell is mainly to credit, or blame, depending on your point of view, for how widespread this idea is, and how widely and incorrectly it is applied. The public perception of the idea is that you can become great at anything, if only you'd practice it for 10,000 hours. Let's take a look at this. The academic research behind the 10,000-hour theory was a study by K. Anders Ericsson, done at Berlin's Academy of Music, and focused specifically on violin players, all of whom were already pretty good by normal standards. Ericsson evaluated that the most elite of these players had achieved an average of 10,000 hours of practice by age 20. Properly understood, this theory was only ever intended to apply in certain tightly defined domains, violin playing and chess, for example, and only applies if certain necessary prerequisites are present, starting young with a basic level of talent. It says that talented people who practice things like chess and violin for 10,000 hours will become pretty good at playing chess or playing violin. It does not mean that anyone can become world-class at anything just by spending 10,000 hours on it. And it definitely doesn't mean that every complex skill can be mastered in 10,000 hours. To take an example, I could spend 10,000 hours trying to be an NBA player, and the fact that I'm 5'8.5" and have pretty average eye-hand coordination would mean it would never, ever happen. Being a great writer, a writer of genius, is one of those things that is rather more complex than being good at chess or playing the violin. Douglas Adams spent a lot more than 10,000 hours writing, and certainly many times 10,000 hours thinking about writing. He was an obsessive writer, a compulsive writer, the type of writer who drew graphs of the moral guilt of his characters, the type of writer who would draft and redraft everything, whether it was a drunken joke or a novel, endlessly, seeking for the draft that would touch the picture rail. He was also a writer who suffered in his writing, who famously missed deadlines whooshing by, and had to be locked into a hotel room by his publisher to deliver the second Dirk Gently novel. There is a line from Chaucer that always makes me think of Douglas Adams.
The leaf's so short, the craft is so long to learn, the say so hard, so sharp the conquering.
For those not conversant in Old English, the life so short, the craft so hard to learn, the attempt so hard, so sharp the conquering. Writing at the level that Douglas Adams wrote is a very hard craft to learn. In his so short 49 years, Douglas struggled mightily with the craft of writing. He transcended both comedy and science fiction. He produced a radio play that redefined the genre, several of the best episodes of Doctor Who ever written, 5 Hitchhiker novels, 2 Dirk Gently mysteries, 2 books of funny names, and, in Last Chance to See, a landmark work of conservation writing. Alongside this, he wrote dozens of essays and articles and speeches on subjects that ranged from evolution, computing, God, the internet, and physics. Douglas Adams is, of course, best remembered for his novels. But I would like to argue that to really understand his legacy, it is necessary to get our arms around the full breadth of his output, and in particular, his non-fiction work. In the next chapter, we will look more closely at this side of Douglas's writing and of his genius.
That was a preview of the new audiobook, Douglas Adams, The Ends of the Earth from Pushkin Industries. Get Douglas Adams, The Ends of the Earth now at Audible, Spotify, pushkin.fm/audiobooks, or wherever audiobooks are sold.